The handsome stranger's skin began to peel away in the moonlight, revealing the jagged, yellowed bone of a laughing skull beneath his silk robes. Adessewa reached for her wedding ring, but as her fingers touched his hand, the flesh dissolved into dust, leaving her trapped in a forest that didn't exist on any map of Nigeria. The story begins in the vibrant, bustling city of Benin City, a place where the ancient walls of the Oba's palace breathe with the spirits of ancestors and the modern streets hum with the energy of the youth. Adessewa was the daughter of a wealthy cocoa merchant, a girl of such breathtaking beauty that men traveled from as far as Port Harcourt and Abuja just to catch a glimpse of her. But Adessewa was as proud as she was beautiful. She had turned down doctors, engineers, and even a local prince, claiming that none of them were refined or wealthy enough to match her standards. She wanted a man who looked like a god and spent like a king. Her father, Poig Binidian, warned her often. "My daughter," he would say, leaning on his carved walking stick, "a fine house with no pillars will collapse in the rain. Do not look for a man who is only a painting, look for a man who is a rock." But Adessewa would only laugh, adjusting her expensive Brazilian hair and checking her reflection in her gold-rimmed mirror. She believed she was destined for a life that transcended the ordinary men of Benin. She wanted a hero film romance, and she was willing to wait until the universe provided a masterpiece. One sunny afternoon at a high-end mall in the government reservation area, GRA, the masterpiece finally arrived. A man stepped out of a silver luxury car that seemed to glow under the Nigerian sun. He was tall, with skin the color of dark chocolate and features so perfect they looked sculpted from bronze. He was dressed in a white linen suit that screamed old money, and he carried himself with an air of quiet, magnetic authority. He approached Adessewa with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. He introduced himself as Prince Azaka, claiming to be from a royal lineage in a distant, hidden kingdom across the border. Prince Azaka was everything Adessewa had dreamed of. He spoke 5 languages, quoted poetry, and didn't flinch when the bill for their lunch came to a sum that could feed a village for a month. He told her stories of his palace, where the floors were made of ivory and the servants wore silk. He didn't ask for her hand immediately, he wooed her with gifts, rare perfumes, gold anklets, and a phone that hadn't even been released in the Nigerian market yet. Adessewa was intoxicated. She felt like she had finally found the billionaire who was worthy of her beauty. Suspense began to build when Adessewa's grandmother, a woman who still lived in a small village on the outskirts of Benin and was said to have the second sight, came to visit. When the old woman saw Prince Azaka's photograph, she didn't smile. She spat on the ground and made a sign of protection. "Adessewa," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves, "this man has no shadow. Look at the photo again. The sun is behind him, but there is no darkness on the ground. A man without a shadow is a man who has borrowed his body." Adessewa dismissed her grandmother as being old-fashioned and superstitious. She told her friends that the old woman was just jealous of her good fortune. But that night, as she looked at the digital photo on her phone, a chill ran down her spine. Her grandmother was right. In the bright light of the mall, Adessewa's shadow was long and clear, but the space behind Prince Azaka was empty. She shook it off, telling herself it was just a glitch in the camera software. She was too close to her dream to let a glitch ruin it. Prince Azaka soon proposed, but there was a condition. He wanted the wedding to be private, held at his family estate on the border of the forest, far away from the prying eyes of Benin City. "My people are private," he explained, his voice smooth as honey. "We do not believe in the loud, flashy weddings of the city. We believe in the sacred silence of the trees." Adessewa, so desperate to see the ivory palace he described, agreed without hesitation. She didn't even insist on her father's presence, believing she could surprise him later with her new royal status. As they drove away from the lights of Benin City toward the dense, green heart of the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The silver car felt colder. The music on the radio faded into a low, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heartbeat. Adessewa looked at Azaka, but his profile seemed sharper, almost skeletal, in the dimming light. "Are we almost there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Azaka didn't look at her. He just smiled, and for the first time, Adessewa noticed that his teeth were too white, too straight, and stayed visible even when he wasn't laughing. They reached a clearing where a magnificent mansion stood, but as Adessewa stepped out, the palace seemed to shimmer and blur. One moment it was marble, the next, it looked like a giant, hollowed-out baobab tree draped in moss. Azaka led her inside, but as they crossed the threshold, he began to stop at various points in the hallway. At the first door, a man she had never seen was waiting. Azaka reached into his pocket and handed the man his gold watch. "The time is up," the man said. Azaka's wrist suddenly looked thin, almost like a stick. At the next door, another stranger waited. Azaka took off his white linen jacket and handed it over. "The skin is returned," the stranger whispered. Adessewa watched in horror as Azaka's chest seemed to collapse inward. She realized with a jolt of terror that the prince was literally giving back the parts of himself he had rented to impress her. The clothes, the jewelry, the very flesh on his bones, none of it belonged to him. He was a trickster who had borrowed beauty to trap greed. Adessewa tried to turn back toward the door, but the entrance had vanished, replaced by the gnarled, twisted roots of the great tree. She screamed, her voice echoing through the hollow chamber, but the only response was the sound of Azaka's rented shoes being handed over to a shadowy figure in the corner. "Azaka, please. What is happening?" she wailed, her eyes darting around the darkening room. The man she had called her prince turned to her, but he was no longer tall. He was shrinking, his white linen trousers pulling on the floor because the legs inside them were disappearing. The handsome chocolate skin she had admired began to flake off like dry paint. First, his nose fell away, handed to a small, crouched creature that emerged from the shadows. Then, his ears were plucked off by a passing spirit. Adessewa watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and the realization of her own foolishness. She had ignored her grandmother's warning for a man who was literally a puzzle of borrowed pieces. Azaka reached up and unzipped his very chest, handing the muscular torso to a tall, thin entity that vanished into the darkness. Soon, there was nothing left on the floor but a pile of expensive white clothes and a single, polished, yellowed skull. The skull didn't stay still, it began to hop and roll, making a dry, clicking sound against the wood. "The prince is home," a chorus of voices whispered from the walls of the hollow tree. The skull rolled toward Adessewa, stopping just inches from her feet. To her horror, it began to speak. The voice was no longer the smooth, poetic baritone of the prince, it was a hollow, whistling sound that seemed to come from the very earth. "Why are you crying, my beautiful bride?" the skull hissed, its jawbone clicking rhythmically. "Is this not what you wanted? You asked for a man who looked like no other. You asked for a man of refined beauty and hidden wealth. I have shown you the truth of that beauty. It is a mask. In the world of spirits, we all know that the greediest eyes are the easiest to blind." Adessewa backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the skull followed her, hopping with a terrifying, supernatural agility. She realized then that the palace was a graveyard of spirits who had once played the same game. Around her, she saw other women, ghosts of their former selves, wandering the hollow tree with vacant eyes. They were the brides who had come before her, women who had chosen the glitter over the gold, the shadow over the substance. They were trapped in a cycle of serving a master who didn't even have hands to hold them. Adessewa felt the coldness of the forest beginning to seep into her own skin, a sign that she was becoming part of the tree's collection. The skull hopped onto a pedestal made of human bone and looked at her with its empty, dark sockets. "You have a choice, Adessewa of Benin," it whispered. "You can stay here and become the spirit that polishes my teeth, or you can give me what you truly value. But be warned, the price for leaving the skull's palace is higher than any bride price your father could ever imagine." Adessewa looked at her Brazilian hair, her gold jewelry, and her expensive silk wrapper. She realized that in this place, her wealth was as worthless as the borrowed skin Azaka had just returned. "I will give you anything," she cried, falling to her knees. "Just let me see the sun again. Let me see the dust of Benin City." The skull let out a chilling, rattling laugh that shook the very roots of the tree. "I do not want your gold, girl. I want your pride. I want the beauty you used as a shield against ordinary men. To leave this place, you must walk back to Benin as a lesson, not a queen." Before she could ask what that meant, the ground beneath her gave way. She felt herself falling through a void of cold air and whispering voices. The scent of the forest was replaced by the smell of damp earth and old bones. When she finally hit the ground, the world went black. She didn't know if she was dead or alive, but she could still hear the clicking of the skull's jawbone echoing in the back of her mind, a reminder that some choices cannot be undone with an apology. Adessewa woke up to the sound of a distant cock crowing, but she was not in a palace, nor was she on the soft mattress of her father's house. She was lying in the dirt at the very edge of the Ogba forest, her body aching as if she had been tossed from a great height. She reached up to touch her face, expecting to feel the smooth skin that had been her greatest pride, but her fingers met something rough and uneven. She scrambled to a nearby stream, the water reflecting the first grey light of dawn, and let out a scream that sent the birds flying from the trees. The reflection staring back at her was a nightmare. Her beautiful, flowing Brazilian hair was gone, replaced by patches of coarse, matted wool. Her skin, once the color of polished mahogany, was now covered in deep, permanent wrinkles and grayish scales, like the bark of an ancient tree. She looked like a woman of 100 years, bent and withered. The price the skull had mentioned was her youth and her beauty. He had taken the very things she used to look down on others, leaving her with a face that matched the ugliness of her pride. Panic seized her. She began to run toward the city, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step was a struggle for her aged joints. As she reached the outskirts of Benin City, the early morning commuters began to appear. A group of young men in a small bus slowed down as they passed her. These were the kind of men Adessewa would have mocked just 2 days ago. "Mama, are you lost?" one of them called out, his voice full of genuine pity. "Do you need help to find your way to the market?" Adessewa covered her face with her hands and wept. They didn't recognize her. To them, she was just another elderly woman struggling on the roadside. She realized that without her beauty and her father's wealth visible upon her, she was invisible to the world she had tried so hard to impress. She reached the gates of her father's mansion in the GRA, but the security guard, a man she had insulted many times for being slow, blocked her path. "Go away, old woman," he said firmly. "My master is in a state of mourning. His daughter has been kidnapped by a stranger. We have no alms for beggars today. It is me, Musa. It is Adessewa," she cried, her voice cracking and high-pitched. The guard laughed, a sound of pure derision. "Adessewa is a flower. You are a dried-up weed. If you don't leave now, I will call the police." She sat by the gutter outside her own home, the sun beginning to beat down on her scaly skin. She watched from the dirt as her father drove out in his black Mercedes, his face etched with a grief so profound it made her heart break. She reached out a withered hand, but he didn't even look her way. As she sat there, she remembered the local prince she had rejected, a kind man who had offered her a stable life and genuine respect. She remembered the teacher who had written her poems, whom she had laughed at for being too poor. She realized that she had spent her life looking for a hero who was nothing more than a hollow shell. The suspense of her life was no longer about who she would marry, but whether she would ever be human again. She spent 3 days living as a beggar outside her own gate, eating the scraps that the kind-hearted house help threw over the wall. She saw her friends arrive to offer condolences, their faces full of performance grief, while they secretly whispered about how they always knew Adessewa's pride would lead to a fall. She saw the truth of her social circle. Without her looks, she was nothing to them. Only her father's grief seemed real, a constant shadow that hung over the house. On the fourth night, the air grew cold, and she heard a familiar clicking sound. The skull had returned. It hopped along the top of the compound wall, its yellowed bone gleaming in the moonlight. "How does the dust taste, Adessewa?" it whistled. "Is the life of an ordinary person as terrible as you imagined?" Adessewa didn't get angry. She didn't beg for her beauty back. She simply looked up at the skull and said, "I was the one who was a skull, Azaka. I had skin, but I had no soul underneath. I am more human now as a beggar than I ever was as a queen." The skull paused, its jawbone hanging open. It seemed surprised by her answer. It had expected her to beg, to offer her father's cocoa plantations, or to trade someone else's life for her own. "You have learned the first lesson," the skull whispered. "But the second lesson is harder. To break the curse, you must do something that the old Adessewa would never do. You must serve the one you despise the most." Adessewa thought of all the people she had looked down upon. The list was long. But there was one person who stood out, her grandmother, the woman she had called superstitious and dirty when she tried to warn her. Her grandmother lived in a small, leaky hut in a village called Utis. Adessewa knew what she had to do. She stood up on her shaky legs and began the long trek toward the village, leaving the luxury of the GI behind. Adessewa's journey to the village of Utis was a pilgrimage of pain. Every mile she walked on the dusty road felt like a year added to her already burdened bones. Her feet, once pampered with expensive pedicures, were now cracked and bleeding, but she did not stop. She passed through markets where people turned their heads in disgust, and she slept under bridges alongside the very outcasts she used to avoid. By the time she reached her grandmother's small mud brick house, she was covered in the red dust of the Edo earth, looking more like a spirit of the forest than a daughter of wealth. Her grandmother, Mama Isosa, was sitting on a low wooden stool, sorting through dried herbs. She didn't need the second sight to know who was approaching. She felt the weight of a broken heart long before Adessewa reached the clearing. Adessewa fell to her knees at the old woman's feet, her forehead touching the dirt. "Mama," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "The flower has withered. I have come to serve the roots." Mama Isosa did not ask for explanations. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply stood up, her own back bent with age, and placed a wrinkled hand on Adessewa's matted head. "The skull takes what is borrowed, but the earth keeps what is real," the old woman said softly. "You will stay here, Adessewa. You will fetch the water from the stream, you will sweep the compound, and you will tend to the lepers in the village clinic. You will do the work that no one sees, for the people who cannot pay you." And so, the Queen of Benin became the servant of Utis. For months, Adessewa lived in the shadows. She woke up before the sun to trek to the river, balancing a heavy clay pot on her head, a task that made her neck ache and her heart humble. She spent her afternoons at the small village clinic, washing the sores of the sick and whispering words of comfort to the dying. At first, she did it out of fear of the curse, but slowly, a change began to occur. She started to see the people behind the poverty. She found beauty in the way a mother shared her last piece of yam with a child, and she found wealth in the laughter of the elders under the village square tree. Suspense gripped the village when a mysterious sickness began to spread, a fever that the modern doctors in the city couldn't name. It affected the breath and the spirit, and soon, the village was filled with the sound of mourning. Adessewa did not run back to the safety of her father's mansion. She stayed. She worked day and night, using the herbal knowledge Mama Isosa taught her to brew teas and cool the brows of the suffering. She forgot about her scaly skin, she forgot about her lost beauty. Her only thought was for the lives in her hands. One night, as she sat by the bedside of a small boy whose breath was fading, the air in the hut grew unnaturally still. The flame of the oil lamp flickered and turned blue. From the corner of the room, the familiar clicking sound of bone against wood echoed. The skull had come to collect its final due. It rolled into the light, its yellowed surface now covered in a thin layer of moss. "He is mine, Adessewa," the skull whistled, referring to the dying boy. "The forest needs new spirits. Give him to me, and I will return your beauty. You can walk out of this hut as the flower of Benin once again." Adessewa looked at the boy, then at the skull. For a moment, the image of her old life flashed before her, the parties, the gold, the envious stares of other women. She could have it all back with a single nod. But then she looked at the boy's mother, sleeping fitfully in the corner, her face etched with the hope that the old woman would save her son. Adessewa stood up, her bent frame straight with a new kind of power. "Take me instead," she said firmly. "I have lived a life of vanity. This boy has a life of truth ahead of him. Take my soul to your hollow tree, but let him breathe." The skull hopped onto the boy's chest, its empty sockets glowing with a dim, red light. It seemed to consider her offer. "A soul for a soul," it asked. "You would trade your chance at beauty for a village brat?" Adessewa didn't hesitate. "Beauty is a mask that rots, Azaka. Love is the only thing that remains. Take me." She closed her eyes, waiting for the cold grip of the spirit world to pull her under, prepared to spend eternity as a shadow in the forest if it meant the boy would live. The skull let out a sound that wasn't a laugh, but a thunderous crack that split the silence of the hut. The red glow in its sockets intensified until the entire room was bathed in a blinding, crimson light. Adessewa felt a sudden, sharp heat coursing through her veins, as if the very blood in her body was being boiled and purified. She collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her chest, convinced that the skull was tearing her heart out to fulfill the bargain. But as the light faded, the heavy, suffocating presence of the spirit vanished. Adessewa opened her eyes and gasped. The air felt light, and the boy on the bed let out a deep, healthy breath, his fever breaking instantly. He turned on his side and began to sleep soundly. Adessewa reached out to check his pulse, and as she did, she stopped. Her hand was no longer wrinkled, gray, or scaled. It was smooth, youthful, and glowing with a vitality she had never possessed even in her prime. She rushed to the small mirror in the corner of the hut. The price had been reversed, but the face looking back at her was different. She was still Adessewa, but the sharp, haughty edge of her beauty had been replaced by a soft, luminous grace. Her eyes, once cold with judgment, now held a depth of compassion that made her truly radiant. The skull had taken her borrowed pride and returned her natural soul. She was no longer a flower to be plucked, she was a woman of substance. Mama Isosa entered the hut, her face breaking into a wide, knowing smile. "The forest only keeps what is stolen, Adessewa. You gave your life away freely, and in doing so, you made it your own. The skull has no power over a heart that knows how to sacrifice." The old woman hugged her granddaughter, and for the first time, Adessewa didn't worry about her hair or her clothes getting dirty. She simply wept with gratitude, finally understanding that true beauty is a light that shines from within. News of the miracle in Utis spread quickly. Word reached Benin City that the missing daughter of the cocoa merchant had been found, but she was not the same girl who had disappeared. When her father's car pulled into the village, he didn't see a haughty socialite waiting for him. He saw a woman standing among the villagers, holding a child and laughing with the elders. When they embraced, the entire village cheered, but Adessewa's eyes remained on the forest line, where she knew the spirits were watching. She returned to Benin City, but the mansion in the GRA no longer felt like a palace, it felt like a house. She used her influence and her father's wealth to build schools and clinics, focusing on the ordinary people she had once mocked. She eventually married the local prince she had previously rejected, not because of his title, but because he was a man who had stayed to help the city during the sickness while others fled. They built a life based on service, and her story became a legend whispered in the markets of Edo State. The educational lesson of this story is a stern warning: Greed for the perfect image often leads us into the arms of a hollow ghost. When we value people only for their exterior, their cars, their looks, or their borrowed status, we become skulls ourselves, empty of true character. Character is the only skin that does not rot. Do not be like the Adessewa of old, who looked for a masterpiece and found a monster. Look for the man or woman whose shadow is made of kindness and truth. The story of the greedy prince and the skull serves as a timeless reminder that in the journey of relationships, what you seek is what you will attract. If you seek only the glitter, you will find a mirror that reflects your own vanity. If you seek a soul, you must be prepared to show your own. Adessewa had to lose her face to find her heart, a price that many in our modern, social media-driven world are still paying today without even knowing it. As we conclude this third episode of our 60-video series, we want to ask you, have you ever been blinded by someone's borrowed skin, their fake success or their charming mask? How did you react when the mask finally fell off? Is our society today becoming a palace of skulls, where everyone is renting a life they cannot afford? Please comment your thoughts below about the story or the educational lesson of the story. Your perspective helps us keep the wisdom of our ancestors alive in this digital age.